Imagine opening your eyes in ancient Egypt, long before alarm clocks, coffee machines, or air conditioning. The first thing you feel is the weight of the sun pressing down, even though it has barely risen. Its golden light pours through the cracks of your mud brick home, and you realize instantly this is no gentle morning glow. This is a furnace waking you up whether you like it or not. The rooster doesn't crow here. The donkeys bray, the goats bleat, and the chatter of neighbors already hauling water jars fills the air. You stretch, but the reed mat beneath you is stiff, the linen blanket scratchy, and the air already dry enough to make your throat ache. Forget snoozing. The Egyptian sun does not allow second chances. You stumble outside, squinting at the glare bouncing off the sand. The Nile glimmers in the distance, promising relief, but you know it's a long walk away, and crocodiles lurk beneath its surface. You, however, are still wondering how to survive the first hour without collapsing. There is no coffee, no cool shower, no gentle playlist to ease you into the day. Instead, there is bread so dense it could double as a weapon, beer so thick it feels like porridge, and a sun so merciless it makes you question every life choice that led you here. And this is just the beginning. You would not last a day, but the Egyptians endure it all with rhythm, laughter, and devotion to their gods. They rise with the sun, they bow to its power, and they carry on as if this blazing start is perfectly normal. For them, it is life. For you, it is already too much. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know from where you're watching, perhaps curled up under a blanket, trying not to melt like an ancient villager under the Egyptian sun. The Egyptian sun does not wait politely for you to wake up. It rises with authority, spilling golden light across the desert. And before you've even rubbed the sleep from your eyes, the heat has already arrived. There is no gentle morning coolness, no soft dew on the grass, no shaded corner to hide in. The desert air turns heavy, almost instantly, pressing against your skin like a hot blanket you never asked for. By the time you step outside, the sand is already warm beneath your feet, reflecting the light like a mirror. The mud brick walls of homes trap the heat, holding it close, and the Nile glimmers in the distance, mocking you with its promise of relief. You think you might escape to its waters, but the villagers know better. Crocodiles lurk beneath the surface, and the river is not a swimming pool, but a lifeline, approached with caution and reverence. The villagers, however, are unfazed. They know the secret to survival: begin early, before the sun becomes unbearable. Farmers are already in the fields, oxen plodding slowly, their breath steaming in the rising warmth. Men guide wooden plows through the soil, scattering seeds with practiced ease, their bodies moving in rhythm with the land. Builders gather their tools, preparing to haul stone before the desert becomes an oven. You, on the other hand, would be undone. The sweat beads on your forehead, your throat dries, and you wonder how anyone can endure this relentless blaze. There is no escape, no cool corner, no relief. The sun is not just weather here. It is a force, a god in its own right, demanding respect and endurance. The villagers bow to its rhythm, rising with it, working beneath it, and resting when it finally descends. By mid-morning, the village hums with effort. The sounds of oxen grunting, chisels striking stone, and children laughing blend into a chorus of survival. You would already be searching for shade, gasping, wondering how anyone survives this merciless furnace. But the Egyptians endure because they must, because their lives are tied to the rhythm of the sun. For them, this is normal. For you, it is already too much. The heat begins early, and it does not forgive weakness. Step into an Egyptian village, and you'll quickly realize how spoiled you are by modern conveniences. There are no switches to flick, no taps to turn, no buttons to press. The homes are simple mud brick structures, built to keep out the sun, but not much else. Inside, the floors are hard, the mats are rough, and the air is heavy with dust. You would search in vain for a fan, a fridge, or even a chair with cushions. Comfort, as you know it, simply does not exist here. The villagers don't complain because they have never known otherwise. They sit on reed mats, sleep on linen blankets, and cook over clay ovens fueled by wood or dung. The smoke curls into the air, filling the room with a haze that would make your eyes water. You would cough, wave your hands, and wonder how anyone can breathe. But the Egyptians carry on, stirring pots of beans and grinding grain as if the smoke were nothing more than a passing breeze. There is no plumbing, no running water, no bathroom tucked neatly behind a door. Water must be hauled from wells or the Nile, carried in heavy jars balanced on shoulders. You would stagger under the weight, spilling half of it before reaching your home, while the villagers walk gracefully, chatting as if the jars were light as feathers. Bathing is done at the riverbank, laundry scrubbed against stones, and drinking water stored in clay vessels that keep it cool only by the mercy of shade. Lighting is no better. Forget bulbs and switches. Here, lamps burn oil, their flames flickering weakly against the darkness. At night, shadows stretch across walls, and the glow is barely enough to see your own hands. You would stumble, mutter, and wish for a flashlight, while the Egyptians sit calmly, weaving, mending, or telling stories by the dim light. Even the food reminds you of what you lack. Bread is dense and gritty, beer is thick and cloudy, and meat is rare. There are no spices to brighten flavors, no sugar to sweeten desserts, no endless variety of snacks waiting in cupboards. Meals are simple, repetitive, and practical. You would sigh, longing for a slice of pizza or a bar of chocolate, while the villagers chew steadily, grateful for what the land provides. Comfort here is not measured by softness or luxury. It is measured by survival. A roof to block the sun, a jar of water to quench thirst, a loaf of bread to fill the stomach. You would fidget, complain, and dream of your mattress and your shower. But the Egyptians endure because endurance is the only comfort they know. And so, as the day unfolds, you realize that in ancient Egypt there are no modern comforts, only the steady rhythm of survival. Step inside an Egyptian home and you'll quickly realize how different life feels without the comforts you take for granted. The houses are built from mud brick, a material shaped from Nile silt and baked hard by the sun. They are sturdy enough to stand against the desert winds, but they are far from luxurious. The walls are rough, the floors are bare, and the ceilings are low, trapping heat inside like an oven. You would search for a breeze, but the air is heavy, still, and filled with dust. Inside, the rooms are small and dark. There are no windows with glass panes, only openings covered with reed mats. Furniture is scarce, perhaps a wooden stool, a reed mat for sleeping, and a clay jar for storing water. You would miss your bed, your sofa, your shelves stacked with books or gadgets. Here, Simplicity is not a choice, it is survival. Cooking is done in clay ovens, often outside to keep smoke from choking the family. The smell of burning wood or dung fills the air, clinging to clothes and walls. Meals are prepared with patience, but the process is messy, smoky, and hot. You would cough, wave your hands, and wish for a kitchen fan, while the Egyptians stir their pots calmly, accustomed to the haze. The roofs are flat, sometimes used for sleeping during the hottest nights, when the inside of the house feels unbearable. Families climb up with mats and blankets, lying beneath the stars, hoping the desert breeze will cool them. You would toss and turn, swatting at insects, listening to the distant hum of the Nile, wondering how anyone rests in such conditions. The harshness of the home is not just physical, but constant. Dust settles everywhere, insects crawl freely, and the heat never truly leaves. Water jars must be refilled daily, food stored carefully to avoid spoilage, and every corner of the house demands maintenance. You would grow frustrated, longing for clean floors, cool air, and a fridge humming in the background. Yet, for the Egyptians, these homes are enough. They provide shelter from the sun, protection from the winds, and space for family life. They are simple, yes, but they are functional, built to endure the rhythm of the land. You would fidget, complain, and dream of your modern comforts, but the villagers endure, because endurance is the only luxury they can afford. And so, as you sit on a reed mat in the dim glow of an oil lamp, you realize that in ancient Egypt, homes are not places of comfort, but places of survival. The Nile may look endless, shimmering under the Egyptian sun, but water is never as simple as dipping a cup and drinking. In ancient Egypt, every drop is precious, and every sip is earned. Wells are dug deep into the earth, lined with stone, and buckets are lowered by rope, creaking as they descend into the darkness. Villagers haul heavy jars filled with water back to their homes, balancing them on shoulders with a grace you could never manage. You would spill half of it before reaching the door, panting under the weight while they walk steadily, chatting as if the jars were light as feathers. Daily thirst is constant. The heat drains you, the dust dries your throat, and the food, dense bread, and salty stews makes you crave water even more. But there is no tap to turn, no glass of chilled water waiting in the fridge. Instead, clay vessels are used to store what has been carried, their surfaces damp to keep the contents cool. Families ration carefully, sipping slowly, knowing that tomorrow's thirst will be just as sharp. Bathing is not a luxury, but a necessity, and even that requires effort. Clothes are scrubbed at the riverbank, bodies washed in the shallows, children splashing while mothers scold them for wasting water. You would hesitate, worried about crocodiles lurking beneath the surface. While the villagers move with practiced caution, aware of the dangers, but too dependent on the river to avoid it, the Nile's floods are both blessing and curse. Each year, the river rises, spilling across the fields, leaving behind rich black soil that makes Egypt fertile. But too much water means destruction, too little means famine. The villagers pray for balance, offering gifts to Hapi, the god of the flood, hoping the river will be kind. You would stand at its banks, marveling at its beauty, unaware that its rhythm decides whether the village thrives or starves. Thirst is not just physical here, it is a way of life. Every task, farming, cooking, building, is shaped by the need for water. You would grow restless, longing for a glass filled instantly at the turn of a tap. But the Egyptians endure. because endurance is the only way to survive. And so, as the sun blazes and the Nile flows, you realize that in ancient Egypt, water is not abundant, it is sacred. Every drop is treasured, every sip a reminder that survival depends on the river's mercy. The first meal of the day in ancient Egypt is not the kind of breakfast you dream about. There are no steaming mugs of coffee, no buttered toast, no sweet cereals waiting in bowls. Instead, the villagers begin their mornings with the same staples that have sustained them for centuries: bread and beer. The bread is made from immer wheat, ground with stone tools that leave tiny bits of grit in every bite. You would chew and crunch, wondering if you were eating food or sand, while the Egyptians swallow calmly, grateful for the nourishment. The beer is thick, cloudy, and closer to porridge than the golden drink you imagine. It is filling, heavy, and packed with calories, designed not for pleasure, but for survival. You would wrinkle your nose at its texture, but the villagers sip steadily, knowing it will carry them through the long hours of labor beneath the sun. Vegetables add variety: onions, garlic, beans, and lentils, all grown along the fertile banks of the Nile. Their flavors are sharp, earthy, and sometimes overwhelming, but they are essential. Dates and figs provide sweetness, a rare treat that brightens the otherwise plain diet. Meat is scarce, reserved for festivals or wealthier households, so most mornings are simple, repetitive, and practical. Cooking is done in clay ovens, fueled by wood or dung, the smoke curling into the air and clinging to clothes. Women grind grain with heavy stones, their arms strong from years of repetition, while children help by fetching water or carrying baskets. You would cough in the haze, wave your hands, and wish for a kitchen fan, while the Egyptians carry on as if the smoke were nothing more than a passing breeze. There are no spices to brighten flavors, no sugar to sweeten dishes, no endless variety of snacks waiting in cupboards. Meals are not about indulgence, but endurance. Each bite is fuel, each sip a necessity, each meal a reminder that survival depends on the land and the river. You would sigh, longing for pancakes or fruit juice, but the Egyptians endure because endurance is the only luxury they can afford. Their morning food is not glamorous, but it is steady, reliable, and strong enough to carry them through the blazing day ahead. In ancient Egypt, the day does not wait for you to ease into it. As soon as the first rays of sunlight stretch across the desert, the village is already alive with movement. Farmers rise before dawn, their bodies trained to beat the heat by starting early. Oxen are led into the fields, wooden plows creak against the soil, and seeds are scattered with practiced rhythm. You would still be rubbing your eyes, wishing for coffee, while the Egyptians are already knee-deep in the work that sustains their lives. The builders are no slower. Stone quarries echo with the sound of chisels striking limestone, ropes creaking as blocks are dragged across sledges. Teams of men chant work songs to keep pace, their voices rising above the grunts of labor. Sweat pours freely, but they endure, because monuments do not build themselves. You would collapse in the dust after the first haul, gasping, while they continue steadily, as if the blazing sun were nothing more than a companion. Craftsmen open their workshops, shaping clay into jars, weaving linen on looms, carving wood into tools. The air fills with the clack of weaving, the hiss of pottery wheels, the scrape of blades against stones. Each sound is part of the village's symphony of survival. You would wander through, marveling at the skill, but quickly realize that every task demands patience, strength, and endurance you do not possess. Even children are not spared. They fetch water, carry baskets, chase goats back into pens, and help grind grain. Their small hands are already part of the labor force, their laughter mixing with the rhythm of chores. You would pity them, but they do not complain. They know that survival begins at sunrise, and everyone must play their part. The Nile watches silently, its waters shimmering as boats carry goods downstream. Fishermen cast nets, their voices calling across the river, their catches hauled in before the sun grows too fierce. You would hesitate, worried about crocodiles lurking beneath the surface, while they move with confidence, trusting the river's rhythm. By mid-morning, the village hums with effort. Dust rises, sweat drips, and the sun climbs higher. But the Egyptians endure. Work begins at sunrise, because to wait is to lose. You would falter, searching for shade, longing for rest, but the villagers press on, bound to the rhythm of the land and the demands of survival. If you think farming is a gentle pastime, ancient Egypt will quickly prove you wrong. The Nile may look serene, its waters shimmering under the sun, but it is the lifeline of the land, and every villager's survival depends on it. Farming here is not a hobby. It is a relentless cycle of toil, sweat, and hope. Each year, the river floods, spilling across the fields, leaving behind a blanket of rich black soil. This is the gift that makes Egypt fertile, the reason crops grow in the middle of the desert. But the flood is unpredictable. Too much water, and homes are destroyed. Too little, and famine looms. The villagers pray to Hapi, the god of the flood, offering bread, beer, and flowers, hoping the river will be merciful. You would stand at the banks, marveling at the beauty, unaware that this rhythm decides whether the village thrives or starves. Farmers rise with the sun, guiding oxen through furrows carved into the earth. Wooden plows creak, seeds scatter, and sweat drips into the soil. The work is endless, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing. You would last perhaps an hour before collapsing in the dust. While the Egyptians endure, their bodies hardened by years of labor. The crops are simple but essential. Wheat for bread, barley for beer, flax for linen, beans, onions, and garlic for meals. Dates and figs sweeten the diet, while papyrus grows thick along the riverbanks, cut and pressed into sheets for writing. Every plant has its purpose, every harvest its place in the rhythm of survival. Children join the work, chasing birds from the fields, carrying baskets of grain, fetching water for thirsty oxen. Women grind flour, bake bread, and store food in clay jars. The entire village is bound to the land, each person a link in the chain of survival. You would pity them, but they do not complain. They know the Nile gives life, and they must honor it with labor. By midday, the fields shimmer with heat, the oxen slow, and the farmers wipe sweat from their brows. Yet they continue, because to stop is to risk hunger. Farming along the Nile is not just work. It is devotion, endurance, and faith in the river's rhythm. You would falter, searching for shade, longing for rest, but the Egyptians press on, bound to the soil, sustained by the Nile, and guided by the gods. By the time the sun climbs high above the desert, the village is already deep in the rhythm of work. The heat is no longer a gentle warmth, but a punishing blaze, pressing down on every back, every brow, every breath. You would wilt instantly, your skin burning, your throat parched, your energy drained. Yet the Egyptians endure because survival demands it. Builders strain against ropes, dragging limestone blocks across sledges that groan under the weight. Their muscles glisten with sweat, their chants rise above the grinding of stone, and their determination seems endless. You would collapse after the first pull, gasping, while they continue steadily, shaping monuments that will outlast centuries. Farmers bend low over the soil, guiding oxen through furrows, scattering seeds, and pulling weeds. The sun scorches their backs, the dust clings to their skin, and the air feels thick enough to choke. You would falter, searching for shade, but they press on, knowing that every moment counts, that the Nile's rhythm waits for no one. Craftsmen sweat in their workshops, shaping clay into jars, weaving linen on looms, carving wood into tools. The heat seeps into every corner, making the air heavy, but their hands do not stop. Each jar, each cloth, each tool is part of the village's survival, and they endure because they must. Even children are caught in the blaze. They chase goats back into pens, fetch water from wells, and help grind grain. Their laughter mixes with the rhythm of chores, but their small bodies are already hardened by the demands of the land. You would pity them, but they do not complain. They know that labor under the blazing sky is simply life. By midday, the village hums with effort, the sun merciless, the air shimmering with heat. Sweat drips, dust rises, and exhaustion creeps in. But the Egyptians endure. Labor under the blazing sky is not a choice, it is survival. You would falter, longing for rest, but they press on, bound to the rhythm of the land, sustained by bread, beer, and faith in the gods. Life in ancient Egypt was not only about enduring the sun and the labor, it was also about surviving the constant threat of illness and injury without the comforts of modern medicine. Imagine cutting your hand while grinding grain or straining your back hauling stone. In your world, you would reach for antiseptic, bandages, or perhaps even call a doctor. In Egypt, you would reach for herbs, prayers, and hope. The villagers relied on remedies made from plants, honey, and oils. Garlic was crushed to fight infections, honey smeared on wounds to soothe and protect, and castor oil used for stomach troubles. These treatments were clever for their time, but they were no match for the diseases that lurked in the dust, the water, and the insects. You would shiver at the thought of drinking river water, knowing crocodiles are not the only danger. Parasites and bacteria thrive there, invisible but deadly. Broken bones were set with splints made of reeds, cuts were wrapped in linen, and fevers were treated with prayers to the gods. Temples doubled as healing centers, where priests invoked divine power alongside their herbal mixtures. You would lie awake, sweating, wishing for antibiotics or painkillers, while the Egyptians endured with faith and patience. Injuries were common. Farmers cut themselves on tools, builders strained muscles, dragging stone. Children scraped knees, chasing goats. Each wound carried risk, because infection could spread quickly and there was no hospital to rush to. You would panic at the sight of dirt in a cut, but the villagers pressed on, hardened by necessity. Illness was constant too. Malaria, dysentery, and fevers swept through households, carried by mosquitoes and dirty water. The heat weakened bodies, the dust clogged lungs, and exhaustion made everyone vulnerable. You would falter, longing for medicine, but the Egyptians endured, because endurance was the only cure they had. And so, as the sun blazed and the Nile flowed, you realized that in ancient Egypt, illness and injury were not exceptions, but part of daily life. Without modern medicine, survival depended on herbs, prayers, and sheer resilience. You would not last a day, but the Egyptians pressed on, bound to the rhythm of the land and the mercy of the gods. If you thought the blazing sun and endless labor were enough to undo you, ancient Egypt has more surprises waiting. The village is alive not only with people, but with creatures that crawl, buzz, and bite. Insects thrive in the heat, swarming around food, clinging to skin, and buzzing in ears. Mosquitoes rise from the Nile's banks, carrying fevers that sweep through households. Flies gather in clouds around animals, landing on faces and food alike. You would swat furiously, muttering in frustration, while the Egyptians endure, hardened by years of living with the constant hum of wings. Disease lurks everywhere. The Nile's waters, shimmering and beautiful, are filled with parasites invisible to the eye. Drink too carelessly, and your stomach twists with pain. Dust fills the air, clogs lungs, and spreads sickness through crowded homes. Cuts and scrapes, so common in daily labor, become dangerous when dirt creeps in, infections spreading without the mercy of modern medicine. You would panic at the first fever, longing for antibiotics, while the villagers rely on herbs, honey, and prayers to the gods. The dirt is constant. It clings to skin, settles in homes, and coats food with a fine layer of grit. Bread itself carries the crunch of stone, ground into flour by hand. Clothes are washed at the riverbank, scrubbed against stones, but the dust returns as soon as they dry. You would sigh, longing for soap and clean water, but the Egyptians accept it as part of life. Women sweep floors, men wipe sweat from brows, but the dirt never truly leaves. It is part of the land, part of survival, part of the rhythm of Egypt. And so, as the sun blazes and the Nile flows, you realize that in ancient Egypt, insects, disease, and dirt are not inconveniences, but companions. You would falter, swatting, coughing, and complaining, but the Egyptians endure, because endurance is the only cure they know. If you thought the heat, the labor, and the insects were enough to undo you, ancient Egypt adds another challenge: the absence of modern hygiene. There are no showers with running water, no soap foaming in your hands, no toothbrush waiting by the sink. Cleanliness here is a constant battle, fought with the simplest tools and the mercy of the Nile. Bathing is done at the riverbank, where villagers wade into the shallows, scrubbing their bodies with sand and water. Children splash nearby, goats wander too close, and crocodiles lurk in the distance. You would hesitate, worried about what hides beneath the surface, while the Egyptians move with practiced caution. Knowing the river is both their lifeline and their risk, clothes are washed against stones, beaten and rinsed, then laid out to dry beneath the sun. Dust settles on them almost instantly, undoing the effort, but the villagers accept it as part of life. You would sigh, longing for detergent and a washing machine, but here, laundry is a ritual of endurance. Teeth are cleaned with sticks, chewed until frayed, rubbed against gums with patience. There is no minty freshness, no fluoride protection, only the steady rhythm of survival. You would grimace, longing for toothpaste, while the Egyptians carry on, hardened by necessity. Homes are swept daily, but dust creeps back, settling in corners, coating mats, clinging to food. Oil lamps leave soot on walls, smoke from ovens fills the air, and insects wander freely. You would fidget, longing for disinfectant wipes. But the villagers endure, because endurance is the only luxury they can afford. Even the food, carries grit. Bread crunches with stone dust from grinding. Water tastes faintly of clay from storage jars. And meals are eaten with hands, shared communally. You would wrinkle your nose, longing for cutlery and clean plates, but the Egyptians accept it as normal. And so, as the sun blazes and the Nile flows, you realize that in ancient Egypt, hygiene is not about comfort, but survival. Without soap, showers, or modern medicine, life is lived in dust, sweat, and grit. You would falter, longing for freshness, but the Egyptians endure, bound to the rhythm of the land and the mercy of the gods. In ancient Egypt, women carried the weight of survival on their shoulders, often in ways that would leave you exhausted before the day had even begun. Their mornings started early, grinding grain with heavy stones, kneading dough, and baking bread in clay ovens fueled by wood or dung. The smoke curled into the air, stinging eyes and clinging to clothes, but they pressed on because the family depended on their labor. You would cough, wave your hands, and wish for a kitchen fan while they endured with steady rhythm. Water was another burden. Women hauled jars from wells or the Nile, balancing them gracefully on shoulders or heads. Each jar was heavy, each step a test of strength, yet they walked steadily, chatting as if the weight were nothing. You would stagger, spill half the water, and collapse in frustration while they carried on, hardened by necessity. Laundry was scrubbed against stones at the riverbank, clothes beaten and rinsed, then laid out beneath the sun. Dust settled almost instantly, undoing the effort, but the women accepted it as part of life. Children played nearby, goats wandered too close, and crocodiles lurked in the distance, but the work continued without pause. Inside the home, women swept floors, tended fires, and cared for children. They patched mats, mended clothes, and stored food carefully to avoid spoilage. Their hands were never idle, their tasks endless, their strength constant. You would fidget, longing for modern appliances, but they endured, because endurance was the only luxury they could afford. Beyond the household, women also worked in fields, helping plant and harvest crops, or in workshops, weaving linen and shaping pottery. Their labor stretched across every corner of life, their struggles woven into the rhythm of survival. You would pity them, but they did not complain. They knew that their strength sustained the family, the village, and the land itself. And so, as the sun blazed and the Nile flowed, you realize that in ancient Egypt, women's daily struggles were not exceptions, but the foundation of life. You would falter, overwhelmed by the endless tasks, but they pressed on, bound to the rhythm of the land and the demands of survival. In ancient Egypt, childhood was not a time of carefree play, but a season of responsibility. From the moment they could walk, children were folded into the rhythm of survival. Their small hands carried baskets of grain, fetched water from wells, and chased goats back into pens. You would pity them, imagining toys and games, but here, work was the play, and survival was the lesson. Boys often followed their fathers into the fields, guiding oxen, scattering seeds, and learning the rhythm of farming along the Nile. Their bare feet pressed into the soil, their laughter mixing with the grunts of labor. But their tasks were real, their contributions essential. You would falter, thinking them too young, but the Egyptians knew that every hand mattered. Girls mirrored their mothers, grinding grain with heavy stones, kneading dough, and baking bread in smoky ovens. They carried jars of water, swept floors, and helped care for younger siblings. Their arms grew strong, their patience steady, their skills sharpened by repetition. You would sigh, longing to see them at school or play. But here, the home was the classroom, and survival the subject. Even the smallest children had tasks. They chased birds from fields, gathered firewood, or helped herd animals. Their laughter was not absent, but it was woven into the rhythm of chores. Play was chasing goats, splashing at the riverbank, or weaving reeds into simple toys. You would smile at their inventiveness, but quickly realize that leisure was fleeting, swallowed by the demands of the land. Education existed, but only for the privileged. Scribes' children learned to read and write, their reed pens scratching across papyrus, their minds filled with symbols of birds, eyes, and snakes. Most children, however, learned through labor, their lessons written in sweat and dust. You would pity them, but they did not complain. They knew that survival began at sunrise, and every child had a role to play. And so, as the sun blazed and the Nile flowed, you realize that in ancient Egypt, children at work were not exceptions, but the foundation of life. You would falter, longing to see them free, but they pressed on, bound to the rhythm of the land and the demands of survival. Surviving in ancient Egypt was not only a physical struggle, but a mental one. Imagine waking each day knowing the sun will scorch your back, the Nile may flood or fail, and every task you perform is not for comfort but for survival. The weight of uncertainty presses on the mind as heavily as the heat presses on the body. You would feel it instantly, the gnawing worry that tomorrow might bring hunger, illness, or disaster. The villagers carried this burden quietly. Their lives were bound to the rhythm of the river, the demands of the land, and the expectations of the gods. Each prayer whispered at dawn was not just ritual, but a plea for balance, for mercy, for stability. You would falter under the constant anxiety, longing for reassurance, but the Egyptians endured. Because endurance was the only answer. Work was relentless, and rest was fleeting. The body grew weary, but the mind grew weary too. Farmers worried about crops, mothers worried about children, builders worried about injuries, and everyone worried about the Nile's flood. You would lie awake at night, restless, listening to the hum of insects and the distant splash of water, your thoughts heavy with dread. For the Egyptians, this was simply life. Children absorbed the same weight, learning early that play was brief and responsibility endless. Women carried the mental toll of endless tasks, balancing household duties with field work, their minds stretched thin by the demands of survival. Men bore the pressure of labor, their thoughts consumed by the need to provide. You would pity them, but they did not complain. They knew that worry was as constant as the sun. Faith offered relief. Amulets hung from necks, prayers were whispered at shrines, and offerings were placed before gods. Belief was not optional. It was the balm for the mind, the hope that tomorrow would be kinder. You would falter, longing for certainty, but the Egyptians endured, because faith was the only comfort they had. And so, as the sun blazed and the Nile flowed, you realize that in ancient Egypt, the mental toll of survival was as heavy as the physical. You would falter under the weight of worry, but they pressed on, bound to the rhythm of the land and the mercy of the gods. By the time the sun reaches its highest point, ancient Egypt becomes a furnace. The air shimmers with heat, the ground burns beneath bare feet, and every breath feels heavy. You would wilt instantly, your energy drained, your body begging for shade. Yet the Egyptians press on, because survival does not pause at midday. Farmers wipe sweat from their brows, their backs bent low over the soil. Oxen slow in their steps, their breath steaming in the heat, but the plows continue to carve furrows. Builders strain against ropes, dragging stone across sledges, their chants growing weaker but steady. Craftsmen in workshops feel the air thicken, their hands slick with sweat, but their tools do not stop. You would falter, searching desperately for rest, while they endure, hardened by necessity. Children, too, feel the weight of the sun. Their laughter fades, their steps slow, their chores become heavier. They fetch water, chase goats, and grind grain, their small bodies already weary. You would pity them, but they do not complain. They know that midday exhaustion is simply part of life. The Nile glimmers mockingly, its waters cool and inviting, but the villagers approach with caution. Crocodiles lurk, parasites thrive, and the river is not a place of leisure but survival. You would dream of diving in, but they know better, respecting its dangers even as they depend on its mercy. Meals offer little relief. Bread is dense, beer is heavy, and vegetables are sharp. There is no feast, no indulgence, only fuel to keep bodies moving beneath the blazing sky. You would sigh, longing for iced drinks and shaded rest, but the Egyptians endure, because endurance is the only luxury they can afford. And so, as the sun blazes and the air shimmers, you realize that in ancient Egypt, midday exhaustion is not a pause but a test. You would falter, longing for comfort, but they press on, bound to the rhythm of the land and the demands of survival. By the time the sun reaches its highest point, ancient Egypt becomes a furnace. You would wilt instantly, your energy drained, your body begging for shade. Yet the Egyptians press on, because survival does not pause at midday. Farmers wipe sweat from their brows, their backs bent low over the soil. Oxen slow in their steps, their breath steaming in the heat, but the plows continue to carve furrows. Builders strain against ropes, dragging stone across sledges, their chants growing weaker but steady. Craftsmen in workshops feel the air thicken, their hands slick with sweat, but their tools do not stop. You would falter, searching desperately for rest, while they endure, hardened by necessity. Children, too, feel the weight of the sun. Their laughter fades, their steps slow, their chores become heavier. They fetch water, chase goats, and grind grain, their small bodies already weary. You would pity them, but they do not complain. They know that midday exhaustion is simply part of life. The Nile glimmers mockingly, its waters cool and inviting, but the villagers approach with caution. Crocodiles lurk, parasites thrive, and the river is not a place of leisure but survival. You would dream of diving in, but they know better, respecting its dangers even as they depend on its mercy. Meals offer little relief. Bread is dense, beer is heavy, and vegetables are sharp. There is no feast, no indulgence, only fuel to keep bodies moving beneath the blazing sky. You would sigh, longing for iced drinks and shaded rest, but the Egyptians endure, because endurance is the only luxury they can afford. And so, as the sun blazes and the air shimmers, you realize that in ancient Egypt, midday exhaustion is not a pause but a test. You would falter, longing for comfort, but they press on, bound to the rhythm of the land and the demands of survival. When the sun finally sinks behind the desert horizon, you might expect relief. But in ancient Egypt, nightfall brings no comfort, only new dangers. The heat fades, yes, but the darkness swallows the village whole. Oil lamps flicker weakly, their flames casting long shadows across mud-brick walls. You would stumble, mutter, and wish for a flashlight, while the Egyptians sit calmly, weaving, mending, or telling stories by the dim glow. Safety is fragile. Homes have no locks, only red mats covering doorways. Animals wander freely, thieves slip quietly, and the night hums with uncertainty. You would lie awake, listening to every creak and rustle, your mind restless with fear. For the villagers, this is simply life. They trust in family, neighbors, and the gods to guard them. The Nile, shimmering by day, becomes a black ribbon at night. Its waters hide crocodiles. Its banks echo with the cries of unseen creatures. You would shiver at the sound, imagining monsters lurking in the dark, while the Egyptians accept it as part of the rhythm of survival. Insects swarm, biting and buzzing, their wings filling the air. Smoke from lamps and ovens lingers, heavy and choking. Dust settles on mats, grit clings to skin, and exhaustion weighs down every body. You would toss and turn, longing for clean sheets and cool air. But the villagers endure, because endurance is the only luxury they can afford. Children sleep on rooftops beneath the stars, their small bodies curled on reed mats, their dreams mingling with the hum of insects. Women rest after endless chores, men collapse after relentless labor, but none sleep deeply. The night is too alive, too uncertain, too unsafe. And so, as the stars glitter above and the Nile flows silently, you realize that in ancient Egypt, nightfall is not a time of peace, but a test of endurance. You would falter, restless and afraid, but the Egyptians press on, bound to the rhythm of the land and the mercy of the gods. In ancient Egypt, uncertainty was not an occasional worry. It was the constant rhythm of life. Every sunrise carried questions with no answers. Will the Nile flood enough to feed us? Will sickness sweep through the village? Will tomorrow bring feast or famine? You would feel it instantly, the gnawing unease of not knowing, the restless weight of doubt pressing on your chest. The villagers lived with this uncertainty as naturally as breathing. They did not expect guarantees, only possibilities. The river might bless them with fertile soil, or it might fail, leaving cracked earth and empty jars. You would falter under the pressure, longing for forecasts, schedules, and certainty. But the Egyptians endured, because endurance was the only path forward. Faith was their anchor. Amulets hung from necks, prayers whispered at shrines, offerings laid before gods. Each ritual was not just tradition, but a way to soothe the mind, to believe that divine mercy could balance the chaos of the world. You would scoff, perhaps longing for science and certainty, but for them, faith was survival. Families rationed food, stored grain carefully, and prepared for lean times. They accepted that hunger might come, that illness might strike, that floods might destroy. You would panic at the thought of losing control, but they pressed on, hardened by necessity. Children grew up with this rhythm, learning early that tomorrow was never promised. Women carried the burden of endless tasks, their minds stretched thin by worry, while men bore the weight of labor, their thoughts consumed by survival. Yet laughter still echoed in lanes, songs still rose in fields, and hope still lingered in prayers. Uncertainty was heavy, but it did not erase joy. And so, as the sun blazed and the Nile flowed, you realize that in ancient Egypt, living with uncertainty was not a curse, but a condition of existence. You would falter, restless and afraid, but the Egyptians endured, bound to the rhythm of the land, the mercy of the gods, and the fragile hope of tomorrow. Ancient Egypt was a land of beauty, but also of relentless hardship. The blazing sun, the endless labor, the constant hunger, the insects, the dirt, the uncertainty, all of it pressed down on the villagers day after day. You, dropped suddenly into this world, would falter almost instantly. The heat would drain you, the food would weary you, the work would break you, and the nights would leave you restless. Most would not last, because survival here was not about comfort, but endurance. Every sip of water was earned, every bite of bread carried grit, every task demanded strength. Illness had no medicine, hunger had no easy cure, and safety was never guaranteed. You would long for modern conveniences, clean water, soft beds, locked doors, medicine, electricity, but none of these existed. The Egyptians endured without them, because endurance was the only luxury they could afford. Faith sustained them. Amulets hung from necks, prayers whispered at shrines, offerings laid before gods. Belief was not optional. It was the anchor that steadied minds against the chaos of uncertainty. You would falter, restless and afraid, but they pressed on, bound to the rhythm of the Nile and the mercy of the divine. And so, as the sun blazed and the Nile flowed, you realize that ancient Egypt was not a place for the faint of heart. Most would not last, because survival demanded more than strength. It demanded acceptance, patience, and faith. You would falter, but the Egyptians endured, their lives carved into the rhythm of the land, their legacy lasting far beyond their struggles. The story slows now, the desert quiet under the stars. The Nile glimmers softly, the villagers rest on reed mats, their bodies weary but their spirits steady. The hum of insects fades into the night, prayers drift into silence, and the world exhales. You close your eyes, carrying the weight of their endurance, and let sleep take you. Good night.